I actually don't think if you were more fulsome in your viewpoints on diversity in board recruitment, I actually think you'd end up being more visibly diverse. You'd be widening your pool of candidates. And people always say you can't get on a board unless you've been on a board. Well, let's start widening that pool and get some subject matter expert in. And I actually believe you will end up being more visibly diverse if you do that.
Welcome to the Future in Sound podcast. I'm your host, Jen Wilson. This is a podcast where we discuss people, planet, and profit. In each episode, we'll learn from world-leading experts who can help us see the future we want and our role in it. This is episode 29, Deeper Diversity. Neil Desai is a corporate director and executive with extensive experience in the public policy and private sectors. Most recently, he served on the leadership team of Magnet Forensics, a Canadian technology company that develops digital investigation software used by more than 4,000 police, national security, and other public and private organizations in over 100 countries. There, he helped lead the growth of the company from startup to its initial public offering on the Toronto Stock Exchange in 2021, and its 1.8 billion Canadian dollar sale in 2023. Neil is a senior fellow with the Centre for International Governance Innovation, an entrepreneur in residence with the Rogers Cyber Catalyst. Neil serves on the board of directors of the Public Policy Forum, Alcohol and Gaming Commission of Ontario in Canada, Innovation Asset Collective, Clear Risk Inc., and is a past director of YMCA Canada. Neil, welcome to the Future in Sound podcast.
It's great to be here.
I wanted to start with an intro of you from your perspective. Do you mind providing a quick overview of where you're coming from?
Yeah, so I've been really privileged in my career, first starting out in the public sector, working in our parliament as a university student in a member of parliament's office, and then interning for a national leader. And when that national leader transitioned to government, I had the incredible opportunity to serve in our prime minister's office. And unlike the White House, the United States, that's not a huge institution. It isn't hundreds of people. And I got a real bird's eye view of how the government of Canada works in areas like immigration, foreign policy, industrial policy, and actually got to make small imprints on those things through my career in the Prime Minister's office, and then went on to serve in Canada's International Development Agency, where we did largely in 40 countries investments in things like health, education, and sustainable economic growth. As I transitioned out of government, I was doing strategy consulting work, and I had this interesting dichotomy of clients. I had traditional industry really just holding on for dear life, and frankly making decisions that I would say weren't in the best interest of their customers, and it had to do with their health. And then I had this young company, 20-person startup out of Waterloo, Ontario, working on a technology to help recover evidence in crimes like child sexual exploitation, human trafficking. And they were consulting with me to understand the regulations around where they could sell their technology from an exports controls perspective, which is deeply technical, but at the core of it, it's about our morality, right? If I have incredible power, should I harness that power for good? And it really struck me at that point that, we can do, and I think we're both privileged, and a lot of your listeners are going to be privileged people, and what you do with your time, it really kind of made me start questioning that. And I had the opportunity to join that little company and serve on the executive team. And it really was about, they wanted to do good in the world, but also run a great business, and asking questions when you're a young company, a few $1 million in revenue, of just because I can legally sell something somewhere doesn't mean I necessarily should. That actually has both moral consequences, but also has economic consequences. And it really struck me as a moment in my personal history that has changed my personal course. So that really led me to Magnet Forensics. I also am a bit of a governance nerd, as you mentioned. I love public policy and I try to stay involved there. And I think governance of companies, but also governance of societies, is a fascinating thing that we don't understand, that these are not cultures, they're actually structural and they're embedded in our structures. So I love to look at companies or organizations and really help them through some of those challenges, but then bring a technology lens to them. So that's my personal background in a nutshell.
It's interesting, this idea of, values and economic value coming into the fore as you made the transition from the public sector into the private sector more formally. And I'm just wondering, your time at Magnet Forensics, what were some of the examples of thinking through a wider view on purpose and how that connects to economic value?
Yeah, so you have to understand the history of the company to understand our why. It was founded by a police officer in Waterloo, Ontario, a young man named Jad Saliba. And Jad, as a young man, got cancer, had to come off the road as a frontline police officer, and had a background in software and was working in cases because of his health situation where children were being lured out on social media, which sadly is still quite common today. And he was distraught as a young father and as a community activist and police officer, and wanted to do something about that. And the tools afforded to him didn't help him. The laws afforded to him didn't help him because a lot of the critical data to his investigation sit in other jurisdictions. When we wrote our laws around evidence, probably 200 years ago, we didn't conceive of the idea that critical evidence could sit in a jurisdiction, a criminal could sit in another jurisdiction, and a victim could sit in another jurisdiction. So Jad is a problem solver by nature, and he started to reconcile that and worked on technology to recover the evidence from the physical device, because so much of our legal system is around physical things when we talk about evidence. And he found there was a way to do that, and it was a very hard technical challenge, but he figured that out. And his personal journey to me is the ethos of the company, that he loved being a police officer. He loved making that direct impact, but he felt he could do more for society if he stepped back and started a business and worked with technologists and business development people to create a sustainable business model. And that, is over 10 years ago now. And really that is the values of the company. Like, people talk about mission, people talk about values, and sometimes it's paint on a wall. But the part that struck me, and to put kind of give you context, I didn't live in Waterloo. It's about 100 kilometers away. But if anyone knows the Toronto area's traffic, it can be a couple of hours. But I was struck by these people. There's 20 of them at the time, and they were on a mission. They were actually on a mission to reconcile the public safety challenges around data. And that to me was very appealing as a young person, again, with some options and quite privileged. But how it translates into the business is fascinating. There is a competitive landscape. There's other companies working on a lot of these adjacent challenges. Historically, there was one publicly traded company, and a lot of the users of the technology, the officers who use these technologies, are extremely nervous about the economics of these businesses because they need access to these solutions to work on, critical digital forensics. The science of digital forensics today, even in the rich world, in the OECD countries, is only used on what are considered major crimes, so homicides, human trafficking. But frankly, today, almost every crime has some form of digital evidence, right? Even break and enter. Now people have these camera devices in their home, or your car has an infotainment system that captures critical data, but it's very labor intensive. And what we saw in the competitive landscape with the companies who went public, or frankly didn't have true values at the core of their business, was there were other markets, right? Like, you could start working as the cybersecurity challenges go up. There's potential for higher revenue per head or more wallet share from the customers to be gained year over year. And as we grew, we faced these challenges, and sometimes we had to go back to the value statement and some of these things in the business. But the parts I learned over the decade at Magnet was, if you have a long enough horizon and your values are true, sometimes it's not easy because you'll see opportunity in front of you and you want to take it, you want to seize it. But when you have perspective of what you're actually on a mission to do, some of these decisions, while not easy, become quite salient on what the right thing to do is. So I think the one thing that I took away from the experience, and it was more challenging as a public company because you're filing quarterly and you are trying to demonstrate that you're economically viable, because so many of the investors and even the employees' personal economics are tied to the perception of the marketplace in the short term, where you're trying to create value and solve big long-term challenges. But if you can maintain focus on perspective, and this is where, again, I think structure matters in how it shapes culture, That's something I took away from that experience, which was incredible.
And can you just to help the listeners with a few examples, if you can share them publicly? Are there examples where you thought to yourself, okay, we're taking a short-term financial hit in order to do something that's aligned with our purpose? And then maybe even connect that to longer term value for the listeners.
Yeah, just a couple examples, right? So in public sector in a lot of places, let's look at the US. A lot of the funding for this streams from the federal government. And, in recent years, the US government has had budget woes. So there'll be things like continuing resolution where the government's operating at 80% of its budget levels, but no new what they would consider discretionary spend. And again, this is all just budget lines. But if a state or municipal police agency can't sign a new purchase order, they wouldn't have access to technology. And there was companies in the technology, the competitive landscape, who would just shut off the software. And these people are doing, again, work that frankly I actually don't think human beings should have to do. Looking at child pornography all day long, 37 and a half hours a week, 52 weeks a year. And these are mission oriented people. And to shut off their software license because of something they have no control over, to me, is wrong. And we would, it came right from the founder and the values of the company that we are here to be a partner, not a vendor. And partners don't do that to partners, right? So we would always ensure that our customers had access to the technology, even if they couldn't pay in the moment. And that's challenging. Not every business can do that when you have high sunk costs. And the irony was, never once did an agency come back and say, well, thank you for the temporary key to continue using software. I want when I now can finally pay, I want it to start today. They would always backdate that to cover those periods. And they would want to work with you more. One of the things that in our public filing process, the part that I didn't recognize, I recognize it from a qualitative perspective, but not a quantitative perspective, the value that's created with the affinity of the customer. That when customers want to do more business with you, I mean, we talk about this in software-based businesses. It's always easier to do more business with your existing customers than go get a net new logo. But how that that doesn't happen overnight, right? That takes a decade of trust, especially in consummate trust business, which is policing. These are essential services that operate 24/7, 365. So the technology not only has to be cool and have all the bells and whistles, it actually has to work all the time. So building that trust with the client, it did prove to me that it actually does increase a willingness to do more business because we expanded our suite from a very, very small point solution now to enterprise grade solutions at the point of the sale of the company. And a lot of that is the technology. There's ambitious technology, and I don't want to downplay that. But a lot of it is also the willingness of the client to want to work with you. So those values statements actually do play out. I'll just give you one more quick example. In our world, every data type is critical to an investigation. And if you were just doing this from a market perspective, a pure market perspective, you would cover just the major applications, so like a Facebook and a WhatsApp and TikTok. But some random data type could be consequential to a massive human trafficking ring and real people's lives. And making those decisions, short-term isms, are very, very dangerous in a business like that. So you really have to have a long outlook that if you're doing this for the customer, there will be value created. You just might not necessarily see it in a 6-week or quarterly cycle.
And so now, with a bit more hindsight, because I'm sure you're getting, investor calls and asking you about the value of this company, do some of the elements that you just shared play into those conversations when they're thinking about the financial value of the company?
Absolutely. Like again, in the public filing and the go private deal, that was a big part of the discourse and discussion of the value created. And I don't, these are public details, but with negative headwinds in the technology environment, still getting 19 times revenue in this economy is staggering. And again, great technology, great logos, but investors were aware we were turning down deals in countries where we could legally sell, but we chose not to because it wasn't aligned with our values. You can't say you're helping pursue justice, but then sell into a market. And people pointed to that in their justifications for investing. And I'll just say again, it's a competitive landscape with other public companies. And at around the same time, or kind of a few months out, those companies are trading at 4 times revenue. So I actually do believe some of these values pieces, how you treat your customer, having a long viewpoint, does create tangible value. Now, again, I will point to, but you have to be able to have that long-term viewpoint, and that to me is a fundamental piece. That if we get stuck in short-term thinking, it's very difficult to reconcile these things.
And so you were there sort of cutting the ribbon as the company went public, basically, and would be well placed, I think, to answer the question. So, for listeners who are running publicly traded companies and they're interested in sustainability, they want to go beyond sort of being slaves to the quarterly report, but they don't want to go so far that it's all about purpose and they forget about, the financial aspects linked to purpose. What would be some of the practical, this is what you can do on Monday morning kind of things
Mm.
to deepen the connection between their strategy and purpose and get that balance right with a long-term view?
Yeah, so I mean, this is going to sound redundant, but to have a long-term view, you have to have a long-term track record and view. So I mean, we went 8 years bootstrap before we went public, and we demonstrated to the marketplace that we could drive profitable growth in an era where profitable growth was not the business model people were being taught, right? Like it was a growth at all cost model. Everyone talks about the rule of 40 in SaaS businesses, or rule of 60. Your growth plus your profitability has to, be 40 or above. But most companies were doing that just on growth. Very few were doing the rule of 40, the rule of 60 on a healthy blend of growth and profitability. And we had that. And as the headwinds came, and you see publicly traded tech companies, underwater, the investors gave us a lot of runway. Yes, we had to file quarterly, we had to show new logos and things like that. But we never got pushback on things like, why are you not selling in these countries? Or why are you giving your technology away to those who can't afford it? We had a charitable sidearm, and we never wanted access to our technology to inhibit justice. So we would donate our software if there was a demonstrable need financially and from an investigative perspective. Never got pushback on these things from the investors, but the track record of showing profitable growth allowed for that. And then I talked about structures. We had the privilege of having a share structure, and it's not all roses, but having control in a public company tied to those who share those values and mission, and a super voting structure and a dual class share structure allow for that. So I know there's some investors who don't like that they like the optionality if the board or management is not delivering the value they want. There are downsides to that. I don't want to say it's all perfect, but it really does allow you to stay focused on the long term. But then the public filing cadence of the quarterlies also remind you um, you're not running a personal hobby, right? That
Mm.
it's not a charity for Neil or charity for the management team or the charity for the board. It really does have to drive shareholder value. I don't think those things are in competition if the investor wants a long-term outcome that's viable, that's sustainable. And my nervousness is I think we went through a generation where people thought, oh, it's tech or it's software and it's just supposed to grow. That's actually not the case. It's still business. You have to build it for one and sell it for two. The how you do that and the why you do that are so important, though.
Hey, it's Jen. I just wanted to take a quick moment to let you know a bit about Rico and what we do. We're a tech-enabled advisory firm that helps private market investors and companies measure sustainability metrics using our software platform. We also help you to set targets and focus your efforts on sustainability areas that really matter for your business. And finally, we help clients to translate all of this work into your core value creation strategy or your business model. Check us out at re.co.com to get in touch. All right, now back to our conversation. So for listeners who don't know, Neil and I are very good friends and have been for many years. I want to make sure that we get into an article that you recently published for the Globe and Mail in Canada about diversity and different types of diversity. So both you and I serve on boards, and we would both be considered, diverse board members from sort of the classic ESG diversity standpoint. But you were speaking about and writing about something different. And I'd just love to get maybe an overview of what you wrote and why you wrote it.
Yeah, so this stems from some McKinsey reports out there that diverse companies perform financially better. And there's been some academic work now to analyze their data in, and it's not challenging diversity for diversity's sake, but they're actually saying that the value created came after the diversity. So there wasn't causality. And that really kind of struck me as an opening to have a more fulsome discussion around diversity. saying that I represent a visible minority group trivializes the experience of every person who's a visible minority, and saying that you represent every woman or every East Coast Canadian or every ESG entrepreneur trivializes the experience. We have so many perspectives that are valuable if they are aligned to the needs of the company and governance. And the point I was making, Canada has had a productivity decline for a whole generation. And that is a huge problem. And our companies are laggards on investing in R&D, in equipment, machinery, anything that makes you more productive. And then I just really stood back and said, people talk about Canada being AI superpower. Our banks, our largest corporations, our telcos are not adopting it. And then you zoom into the boards of these companies. And I'm not saying the boards are the only things. You can have these things in management and such, but our boards have become generalists and less diverse in the invisible way. We're often Canadian in our public markets so focused on the visible diversity quotient and balance that we forget that we're actually solving for many different challenges, right? Like if our banks are laggards on AI, maybe you shouldn't only have in your matrix a need for an accountant and a lawyer. Maybe you should have someone who's worked at depth in the AI space. In Canada, we're having challenges with back to work post pandemic. Maybe you should have people who have worked with Gen Z and millennials and got high productivity from those cohorts on your board. My nervousness is we are taking a very superficial view in Canada of diversity, and the results will continue to, on the productivity side, lag if we don't take these seriously. And again, it starts with structure. I'm not suggesting boards are the only place that structure exists, but the tone starts at the top. And if you don't value it, if it's not in your skills matrix, if it's not in your strategic plan, how do you expect those who are compensated structurally to drive to outcomes will get those outcomes? If people aren't asking tough questions about the adoption of AI or getting more productive per head, leveraging technology, cybersecurity, intellectual property, if you're not getting good questions at the board table, are you getting them at the management table? Are you investing for the long term in these spaces? And that makes me very nervous. And that's why, I was nervous about writing the piece, because one could argue I'm kind of just rubbing visible diversity under the rug. And I actually don't think if you were more fulsome in your viewpoints on diversity in board recruitment, I actually think you'd end up being more visibly diverse. You'd be widening your pool of candidates. The interesting thing about our pool in Canada is it's quite small. And people always say you can't get on a board unless you've been on a board. Well, let's start widening that pool and get some subject matter expert in. And I actually believe you will end up being more visibly diverse if you do that.
It's so interesting because I'm going to try to maintain you being the interviewee and me being the interviewer
Yeah.
because I feel very
No,
strongly about this
jump in.
topic.
Let's
I
do
just
this.
actually we're recruiting a couple of people onto one of the boards that I'm on, and you and I have talked about this. I talked to one of the top recruiters in Canada, who I will not name, who has been, involved in recruiting for boards across manufacturing and engineering for decades. And one of the things that he said during our conversation was, well, some boards aren't ready for a woman. Needless to say, he was not hired. But, the reason for that was just, I think it came from the space that is a bit dangerous when we look at diversity for boards, which is it's all about the gender or the visible minority versus not. It's all that it's not actually integrating it into the board matrix and the capabilities, as you say, the
Mm.
skills that you're actually looking for. And therefore, we get individuals, like personally, I would never want to be on a board because I'm a woman. That would be
Hmm.
horrible. And it actually doesn't progress us toward, we're talking about purpose in this conversation, the purpose of creating equal opportunities, not
Yeah,
necessarily
yeah.
equal outcomes. And I think so that's your point off the top, which is to trivialize experience. This may be first step, like diversity on boards 1.0. It's been good on the one hand because we're having the conversation around, what kind of opportunities do we have on boards? But on the other hand, we have seen the placement of individuals solely based on, one element, one dimension of their experience, which actually undermines the opportunity because then the female on the board in manufacturing who doesn't have experience in manufacturing or isn't part of, a viable board matrix skill set is then seen as, oh, well, we're not ready for the woman on the board because, she's not adding the value. It's like, wait,
Mhm,
wait, wait, let's
mhm.
stand back for a second and think about what diversity is really about. And, my view is that it's about diversity of thought.
Yeah. I think you're bang on. And listen, I think there is a moral imperative that boards should reflect the companies they serve, the societies they operate in. Like there is a moral imperative. I don't want to, say that's not the case. But we do a disservice to putting people on boards if they're not set up to succeed. But we
Exactly.
really can't trivialize the experience. Like I channel the former chair of PepsiCo, a visible minority woman, and she
Mhm.
had to remind people that her perspective is not as a stay-at-home mother woman. Like it's not an archetype of a cliche. She reminded that she was a business executive who spent very little time with her children because in that era there wasn't subsidized childcare and things like that. So like her perspective actually was more like the historical board of PepsiCo,
Mm.
right? So I think if I just put you there, I think it's not just about non-performance. It's also about perspective. My biggest fear is that we get a bunch of yes people at boards and they don't introduce the difficult questions. They don't bring their diversity of experience to the table to make organizations better, right? Like controlled conflict to me is how you get better outcomes.
Mhm.
And if even if the perspective is the same, that in an engineering firm, if you had 12 engineers, you will again, regardless of gender and what country they come from, you have a risk, perspective risk. So I think we got to be a little more mindful and less superficial about our board matrices, our recruitment. And I think this is a naturally obvious statement, but I'm going to make it anyways. When you widen the pool, you will for sure become more diverse. It might not be in the next cycle, but again, if your horizon's long enough and you're turning over every stone to find the best people, you will become more diverse.
In a way, coming back on the initial statement from the recruiter I was just describing, you know, this whole some boards aren't ready for a woman. I would argue that if you had the right skill set and it was fitting the perfect slot on your board
Mm,
matrix, I cannot think of many boards that would not be ready for a woman. So it's sort of collapsing two different issues, right?
mm.
And it's actually a recruitment issue. I want to come to the sort of broaden the pool question now, which is how do we do that effectively? So, for example, a lot of boards are looking for former CEOs or people from the C-suite, which,
Right.
can really limit what kind of talent they're seeing, or they've been on a board before, as you say. What are some of the steps that individuals recruiting onto a board can take to really tap into that wider pool?
The interesting thing is my piece actually might be seen as more not gender biased or race biased, but I got a couple people who subtly said I was an ageist. Um, and I think you're getting on to something that the point I make in the preface of the piece is that I believe the world is not getting more complex. I think the velocity at which the complexity is coming at us in the business world is increasing. And that's really the acute problem we're trying to deal with. And there's a danger in having these board members who have been around for 20 years ticking boxes saying, well, I took a module on AI, therefore I'm an AI expert. I think in a world of deep technocratic understanding of these complex matters, we are, especially in Canadian boards, and I'm skewed to Canadian boards, have board generalists, right? Like they can read a financial statement, they understand the oversight and not sticking their hands in where they shouldn't be. They understand those things. But when it comes to these deeper technocratic subject areas, and I mentioned a few previously, like cybersecurity and AI, governance matters, right? Like understanding what a good data policy looks like and what it should be structured as. And cybersecurity is not just about how many dollars you're putting in. You actually have to have an implementation strategy, change management strategy, behavioral strategy. You have to think about things like should high risk employees be allowed to work from home? Those are policy questions that boards actually have to look at. And if you don't have some of that technocratic understanding to get into, it's actually a risk at your board table when you say, well, I've got tertiary understanding of AI. And the only way to address this in my mind is to widen the pool. You can teach someone the fundamentals of governance. You can teach them to read financial statements. You can teach them that, hey, you should frame that as a question, not direct management on that, because that's actually not your prerogative. What you can't teach them right now is some of these complex subject matters. And I'm seeing this at the board, and I'm not an ageist. anyone can learn, right? There's a great line in Good Will Hunting. You could have got that same education in $8 in late fees at the public library. There's infinite amount of information out there. So again, I think anyone can upskill and go deep, but you have to go deep in these nascent areas of governance. And if your directors are not willing to do that, I think you now need to start looking for some more technocrats and actually valuing that structurally. So if you're in a data intensive business like banking, do you actually need a board member who can be your lead director on something like data governance and AI solutions? Right? Like that to me will be tantamount to, we need a lawyer. We need an accountant. I actually do believe we're going to get to that point because these nascent areas of governance are transforming businesses at such velocity.
Neil, I could, again, on this topic, I could ask many follow-up questions, but in the interest of time, I wanted to, again, final pivot to one of my favorite questions, which will help listeners understand what's shaped how you think. I'm wondering if you had to name one book that's most shaped the way you work or how you think in your work, what book would that be?
Yeah, so I'm going to be a bit hokey and go off the shelf of like a bestseller book, but it does speak to me still when I pick it up. And when you lose your North Star, and again, I think we live a pretty privileged life. We get some options in life on what to do. So I'm mindful that not everyone gets this privilege, but it starts with why. And Simon Sinek, has become a bit of a meme out there, but I actually think when he wrote It Starts With Why, it gave a lot of people focus that I'm not in the business of technology. I'm not a software business. I'm in the business of pursuing justice and leveraging technology to do it. That's what I did for the last 10 years. And it really starts with framing your why and a lot of tough decisions. I don't say they become easy, but the outcomes become much more salient that you should be pursuing. And I still think it speaks to me to this day.
Neil Desai, thanks so much for joining us on The Future in Sound.
Thanks for having me.
The Future in Sound podcast is written and hosted by Jen Wilson and produced by Chris Attaway. This podcast is brought to you by Rico, a tech-powered advisory company helping private market investors pursue sustainability objectives and value creation in tandem. If you enjoyed this podcast, don't forget to tell a friend about it. And if you have a moment to rate us in your podcast app, we'd really appreciate it. Until next time, thanks for listening.